I moved to town, I'm a total shaker from my head on down. Well, you may go. How about another round of applause? Can't stop when something is really that stupendous. And now it's my pleasure to welcome you, to welcome Daniel Blackman, who serves as the Regional Administrator for EPA's Southeast Region, Region 4. In this role, Daniel is leading EPA's efforts to protect public health and the environment for the region spanning Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and 6 federally recognized tribes. It's my pleasure to welcome Administrator Blackman.
How are you all doing? Come on, y'all. I came from Atlanta. You got to do better than that. How y'all doing? All right. Well, on behalf of the Biden-Harris administration and my boss, Administrator Michael Regan, I'm very proud to not only be here before you today, but as the first black male to run the Environmental Protection Agency in the Southeast. I'm very proud to represent a space that represents 56% of our nation's historically black colleges and communities where environmental justice has been a priority, climate resilience has been a priority, and to the descendants of this film, to those of you who are here, to those that make up, as my grandfather, who was a diplomat to the United Nations, would say, we're well able to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own. And there's a Native American proverb that says, and this is really important for this special moment that I think is here, we do not inherit the planet from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And I think today is about the next generation. It's about what we saw in the film. It's about our ability to support these efforts, but also our ability to fundamentally transform where we are and also where we're going. Michael Regan, who is my boss and the first black man to lead the entirety of the EPA, is also an alum of an HBCU, North Carolina A&T. I'm an alum of Clark Atlanta University. Shout out to Howard University being right in our backyard, and so many other HBCUs, but I'm gonna keep this really simple. Where do we go from here? A great question that many of us had faced, where in some instances land and homes were passed down generation to generation, but too many of those who represent the best of what we have to offer have inherited poverty, have inherited a lack of resources. And I'm very proud to be a part of an administration that has prioritized $1.2 trillion in the bipartisan infrastructure law with what is in place called Justice 40 to commit a significant amount of funding to opportunities not just like this, but when you think about the impact of environmental justice, not just in Mobile, Alabama, and Africatown, but in Lowndes County, Alabama, in Jackson, Mississippi, all over the United States where we've seen time after time commitments made that have not always been resolved. I'm very proud to say that over $5 billion has been committed through this administration through our Clean Bus program. $3.5 billion for brownfields, $60 billion, well almost $60 billion, $50 billion for water infrastructure. These numbers mean absolutely nothing if we don't take our responsibility as an administration to focus fundamentally on how we're going to transform communities and build a better generation for those of you that are here. In addressing these issues, some of the fundamental challenges that we have are making sure that when we see movies like this that inspire us and that challenge us, we also remember the tremendous responsibility that all of us share in transforming a future. This is, in my opinion, the first generation that can fundamentally address and eradicate poverty. But it's also the first generation that is experiencing the tremendous impacts of climate change, and the last generation, arguably, that can deal with it and that can deal with those issues. But when you look at a film like this in closing, and you see the challenges that we're faced throughout this space and what we're dealing with, the question you have to ask is, what is your role and what is your responsibility, whether you are a descendant or you're someone that has literally stood on the shoulders of your ancestors. And for all of us that are here today in this historic place, it reminds me of a quote that I'll leave you with from my mentor, the Congressman John Lewis, who had spent such a tremendous amount of time in my life and prepared me for where I am today, in which he said, ours is not the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is not the struggle of one judicial appointment or one presidential administration. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, or maybe many lifetimes. These areas that have challenged us have also opened the door for each of us to take the personal responsibility it takes to leave this room and to educate our communities, to work with the federal family in a sense of how we can be accountable and responsible to that which we'll do to you and for you and to our communities. But more than anything else, in how we're able to restore underserved communities, areas that have been left out, communities that have had a legacy of challenges that range from pollution and environmental justice to multiple areas that I believe this panel that I'm going to introduce can begin to solve. So on behalf of the President and the Administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, we're absolutely honored to know that we stand in a position to offer the resources, the help, and the support. I want to thank Caroline Freeman, who is traveling with me today, who's my EAR director. Caroline, thank you for being here in the front. You can clap for Caroline. And also David Champagne, who's here with me, my special assistant. And I'm saying that because we're not here to check a box. We're here to make sure that the resources and the full extent of what we can do is offered in this space. At this time, I'd like to introduce Mary Elliott, the museum's curator of slavery and freedom. I'd like to introduce Margaret Brown, the director. Y'all can keep that same energy. It's good to see you, Margaret, and I want to give you a very public Happy New Year. Amir Questlove Thompson. Y'all know Questlove, executive producer, and Clotilda, Descendant. We all know a lot about this brother. It was so good to see you in Mobile, brother, and it's good to see you here as well. Dr. Kern Jackson, co-writer and co-producer. I'd like to introduce Joycelyn Davis, film subject, and Clotilda, Descendant as well. I know y'all don't think I was going to interrupt her applause, right? And lastly, but definitely not least, Veda Tunstall Robbins, film subject, and Clotilda, Descendant as well. Thank you all so much, and let's give a round of applause for our panel.
Can y'all hear me? All right. Well, welcome to the dining room, because right now we're at the dining room table having a conversation that it just so happens there's an audience listening in, okay? So I want to say, one, thank you all so much for all your support for this film. It's so important and so powerful and so impactful. And the thing I think about with the film is that this is a film that covers many stories and themes. And don't mind me if I use my notes. I usually hate using notes, but there's so much I don't want to miss. And so when I think of the themes that come forward in this film, it includes that this is an American story. It's a story of environmental racism, of industrial encroachment, of heritage stewardship, of preservation, of activism, of reparations, of community, of slavery, of freedom, of community development, of ancestry, of love, of faith, of justice, and of Black power then and now. That's what this film is. And so we're really honored to be able to have this discussion today. I have a few questions for y'all. So I'm gonna start with you, Margaret, as we're sitting here at this table and having a casual conversation. Kudos to you for this wonderful project, you and Kern and everyone involved. And I know that you are an Alabama native and you're connected to the community of Africatown now and forevermore. But I'd like to know, one, about how you first became connected to Africatown, and then I have something else I need to ask you about that.
Well, I made a film 16 years ago called The Order of Myths, and it's about segregated Mardi Gras in Alabama. And my mom pulled me aside before we started filming and said, Margaret, you need to know, Helen Mayer, the white Mardi Gras queen, her family brought the last slave ship to the United States. And so I took note, and then after Mardi Gras was over, when we were still filming, we were filming with Stephanie Lucas, the black Mardi Gras queen, and her grandparents around their table. And Stephanie's grandfather, Barry Malone, mentioned that he was descended from the Clotilda. And I remember we knew in that moment that this film was deeply connected to the Clotilda and the connection between these two queens. And so that's sort of how I grew up in Mobile, but that's when I really first learned about the Clotilda. We weren't taught it in school. I went to public school in Alabama, and that was not something I remember learning. So yeah, that was sort of 16 years ago is when it started.
Well, I remember when we filmed the scene here in the museum. And I remember I talked to you quite a bit about you. And you've done a phenomenal job. You were very intentional about not intervening in this story, but really providing a platform for the descendants to tell their story. But in this museum, and I think you've done this, told the American story through the African American lens. But as the curator of slavery and freedom, when I talk about that, I always tell people that lens looked out onto a world that included enslaved Black people, free Black people, indigenous people, both held in bondage and free, poor white people, yeoman white farmers, and planter elite. So if I were to ask you about your story, where do you fall on that spectrum? Did you have any ancestors who were enslavers? And even though you did a phenomenal job of keeping to staying outside of telling the story, it intrigued me so much, I want to know your story.
Thank you for asking. No one on stage has ever asked that. But my dad is Jewish and my mom is not, and on my dad's side of the family, we were enslavers. And I think we talked about that at the museum, because I was thinking back then, how do I include myself? I didn't really realize then that, because I was thinking this is, like you said before, this is an American story, and I thought I have to acknowledge my family's past in this, And I think at a certain point I realized I didn't want to include myself. That would be I wanted to put them forward. It's not about me, And so that's why I decided not to include that. But I'm very aware of it and struggled with that decision. I mean, it's something our crew, we all talked about a lot.
I understand the perspective of it's not about you, but what's really interesting is it is about all of us, because it's a shared history. So as an African American, I deeply appreciate that you provided that platform and didn't intervene, and their voices came forward, the descendants' voices came forward. I have some other questions for you, but I'm going to go down the row here real quick. So Amir, It's nice to finally meet you, not on a Zoom screen.
I know, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So welcome back to the museum. You've been here several times, I know.
I feel like I live here.
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
And you are in the walls here, so to speak, because everyone knows about the great work that you've done as an artist and your contributions. So we know that you came to find out about your lineage through Finding Our Roots with Henry Louis Gates.
Right.
I'm curious about what more you have found out and what happened, the timeline of when you were able to connect with the people of your community in Africatown, for
Right.
lack of a better word, yeah.
Yeah, I'll say that I was approached by the Finding Our Roots crew around 2014, 2015. Did my DNA stuff, whatever, and was expecting to hear from them at least within a year. And then 2 years went by, and I thought oh, well, of course, I don't have a history, which is what most of us think. We can barely name our grandparents. Some can't even name our fathers, you know what I mean? So I just thought well, of course they didn't find anything. I don't have a history. And they were like, no, quite the opposite. And so when Henry Louis Gates is telling me, you're part of the 1% of African Americans that can name their ship, at the very most you can you could name your destination. Like, I know that Nas discovered like his family's in Virginia or that sort of thing. But to know the destination, to know the ship, and to know the origin, to say it's a game changer is really understating it. Like, and to see Maggie and Charlie Lewis, like, to know names and all those things, like, it completed me in a way that I really can't articulate. Even in speaking the words, like, it makes me emotional. But finding that out in 2017 100% changed the entire trajectory of my life. Because now, you know, before that moment, I don't know who I am. I don't know where I came from. You know, I'm from West Philly. Now, it's like, yo, I'm from Benin. And now I'm learning about, you know, Yoruba and Ife, like literally learning my entire culture, everything. So once I got wind that this was happening, you know, when I was asked to come aboard as a producer, of course, it was a no-brainer, but not just for like business reasons, as in like, you know, furthering my business career, but just so that hopefully me being complete and finding out who I am and where I came from and who my cousins are and all that stuff, that this will also help. You know, you can heal the past and the future simultaneously. So that's why I felt it was important to do this.
Well, that's really important and really impactful. And I know your cousin is sitting right down the way. And, you know, I can only imagine what that's been like for you. I know my family walked out of Mississippi after a confrontation with the Klan in 1890, and they never went back until my mother and I went back in 2005. But we met relatives we didn't know existed, and they didn't know we existed. So I can imagine what that has been like for you, and that feeling of not being able to put into words is kind of like when I opened, sitting at the table and talking and eating a good plate of food and really learning who are all these new family members that I have. So I deeply appreciate that. Let me ask you, I know my friends call me crazy because I see the world, yeah. Let me just be clear, transparency, I've known Kern since I was 15. So if you hear him say amen every now and then, it's because he does know me very well. But Amir, I see numbers in colors. So 2s, 4s, 6s, even numbers are green, orange, yellow. Odd numbers are blue, red, you know, cool tones.
Synesthesia.
Yes.
Or, yeah,
Yes.
numerical synesthesia, yeah.
And I know there's this amazing, beautiful soundtrack by Ray Angry and Rhiannon Giddens. But I imagine in your head there are stacks and stacks, crates, we refer to it. And I just am curious as to when you walked the landscape and when you met different community members and family members, what was some of that soundtrack that played in your mind? Because I can only imagine there was a soundtrack that went through your mind.
There's really nothing like reconnecting, okay, pun coming, reconnecting to your roots. Thank you, enjoy the calamari, thank you. You know, the first time coming down there, I really couldn't gather any thought other than, really, I just kept saying like, wow, I really came from somewhere, which, you know, also grappling with the guilt of having that privilege, you know, because the second I found out, I literally told everybody within earshot, like, yo, Benin, you know where Benin is? And I come from Benin. Yes, Amir, we know. And, you know, and just to revel and absorb that, that's literally all I could think of. But just actively every day, 100% trying to reconnect to every aspect of it. I want to know the foods they ate, the music they played, the true spiritual practice that I'm supposed to have, not that it was forced upon me, which is a long conversation that we need to have in this country. But yeah, just it's literally affecting my life as we speak. Like 2018 Amir wouldn't have, despite being Questlove for 30 years, like I'm notoriously famous for hiding in plain sight. So just even the confidence that instilled in me that to take a leadership role and to really own the history, that's what I'm going through right now. It's like I think for all of us, even though the film is like a tangible evidence that will never be lost to history, because let's face it, black erasure is real. I think that for a lot of us, all of us on the stage, the journey of this film, really the story starts now. Like this is almost a preview, and then the story with every aspect of this film happens now.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I can tell you, I'm sure everyone in this room is going to stay on the journey with you. So thank you. So, Dr. Kern.
Yes, ma'am.
I had the pleasure of seeing you again after so many years, and you said to me, my friend's doing a film. Can I introduce you to her? Mm-hmm. And I remember saying, I got work to do. I'll meet her in a little bit. Mm-hmm. Little did I know this was your friend, mm-hmm. and all the dynamic stuff that she's done and the two of you have done together. And so I want to speak about your role, and particularly your role as a folklorist. You know, this is such a griot moment, right? And I think of you, and I think of Zora Neale Hurston, and I know that quite often you've been on panels and people call you the folklorist and talk about Zora Neale Hurston, but what is a folklorist?
Well, first, today is Zora Neale Hurston's birthday.
Capricorn.
And all of us have people in our families that are the story keepers. But sometimes the story keepers need documenting, which I think is what Hurston did so well. And she was very patient. For those of you who read Barracoon, you know, whether Cujo was crying, whether he was laughing, or whether he was just telling her to shut up and get out of his way, she was being ethical. And so what griots and story keepers and documentarians do is they try to put people in position so that the story can be identified, recognized, and do the work it's supposed to do. And so the folklorist is the ethnographer, is the person who listens, who photographs, and then people come along and say, can I see your footage? And you can say yes. And I can take you to the dead people, or I can take you to the live people who you want to go see. And you know, essentially, it's a soft science, and we need to acknowledge and be respectful of the fact that when Ms. Lorna speaks, and this would be their elder, you need to pay attention, because you're going to be the one who has to speak. And so essentially, and I'm a teacher, right? And so it's all about the young ones and the unborn. Margaret and all of us made this film because we know there's some child in the womb who's going to need to know the story, and who's going to need to act on the story, like Brother was saying here. So in my mind's eye, that's what I think about when I think about griots and folklorists and people who pay attention to culture and put it under a microscope.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. And the other part of that is preservation, that word preservation. And so how would you, and it seems like Amir has addressed this, how would you speak to this film serving as a tool for preservation?
I was just talking about this. Ramsey and Joycelyn going to the Lincoln Memorial and standing on that spot where King stood. There are little boys and girls in Alabama going, I want to stand on that spot. I want to be like that. And they'll be the ones who pick it up and carry it forward. But also, our film is strictly composed in terms of democracy, small d. There was a lot of transparency. Margaret and Zach and Justin and them would say, how does this sound to y'all, Joycelyn? And Joycelyn would say, I don't like that. That won't go in the film. So a community has to make stuff for it to be preserved. Yeah. That's all I got to say.
Thank you. That's all you have to say for now. I'm coming back around. So, Joycelyn, my Joycelyn. I can claim you as my Joycelyn. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to ask you a very straightforward question. you are among the descendants, obviously, but if you could speak to this feeling of, that the community had always known this history, always knew where the Clotilda was, always knew the story, and what it means, like, as you're walking through this space where people are just now learning about it, but as is the case with many historic Black communities, Black people know, and as has been said on this stage already, know and talk amongst ourselves and preserve that history ourselves. But what does it mean to kind of navigate this space, even though you all already knew this history?
Oh, it's kind of emotional being here today and seeing you, because you and I have a story, and it's an amazing story. Again, just like you were saying, we grew up with this story. The shit was documented. Captain Foster kept notes. It was in our Alabama history books, and I couldn't fathom that people thought it was lore, right? And we grew up with the story. We attend the church that our ancestors founded. My family still lives on the land that they bought from their enslaver. So, how do you navigate all of that when people thought it was lore? So, that's a heavy burden to carry, to see people come into the neighborhood and not knowing. And it's always been there. And it's just like, we've been shouting this story for decades.
Yeah.
And to say that it was lore, I just couldn't understand that.
Well, it's interesting. It reminds me of the scene with Emmett, who I love, and where he's in the graveyard and the gentleman walks up to him and starts talking to him. And I worked down in Edisto Island, South Carolina, and the one thing that crossed my mind was I grew up in suburban Maryland, right? But I thought about walking the landscape. People down here, they walk past plantation sites every day, right? There's slave cabins right down the road, And so then for people to walk in and go, wow, it's like, yeah, no, this is my everyday life. And I think that's, something to acknowledge. I also want to ask you and also bring up that relationship that we have. I met Miss Joycelyn at a listening session at the local church. And I went to various churches and held listening sessions with intergenerational groups. And I'll never forget, Joycelyn turned to me as I was getting ready to leave, and she said, Miss Mary, I want to take you to my car. I want to show you something. So the whole time I've been asking everyone, have y'all read, Sylviane Juf and, Natalie Roberson and all these other folks, right? What do you know about the story? And people were slowly talking. And we literally get to her car, and she pops her trunk, and in her trunk are all these historic documents. And I said, what you doing with this in the trunk of your car? And she was like, I've had it. Now, the good thing was, I was like, thank Lord Jesus that she knew not to throw it away. But I'll never forget that day. And so that scene that you see at the end of the film is a full circle moment. It's really powerful. And I want you, Joycelyn, to talk about what it means to be in these Black churches, faith houses, where we do talk about this history and pass it on, and the role of church members and these intergenerational dialogues.
Well, about religion in the South, churches every day, some days for people. And Union Baptist is a sacred place because our ancestors founded Union Missionary Baptist Church over 150 years ago. And when you met me, I was in the midst of thinking about planning an event to celebrate our ancestors. This was something that was done in the founding of our church. So in my mind, I was like, I want to have an event to celebrate our ancestors. And when you had that meeting, I was telling you about our family historian, and you asked me, you was like, well, what are you doing? And it's like the record stopped. And I was challenged, but in a good way, right? So I decided to, and along with others, spearhead an event called the Spirit of Our Ancestors. And this year will be my 5th year celebrating that event. So when we talk about religion in the church and what it means, our ancestors would dance on Sunday. They were Yoruban and Muslim, and they would, and it was a freedman named George, Free George, say, well, why don't you go to church? And they was like, church, right? So finding that church was like a safe haven for them. And I'm grateful that that church is there, and there are several other churches in the community that we're all one. And you know, in the South, there's a church on every corner, right? And in the Africatown community, there are 5 churches that are together. So there's Union Baptist, there's Yorktown, there's Hopewell, and there's Our Mother of Mercy. And that's what's really keeping us together, is the church.
Yeah.
And that's how it is in the Black community, and we all know that. So I'm very proud of our church still standing. It's I think it's the second oldest church in Mobile.
Yeah.
So we have that beautiful historical marker in front of Union Baptist showing the names of our ancestors who founded the church, their origin. So that's something for people to come in, and you can tangibly touch it. I just feel like when I touch my ancestor's name, and to know that he was one of the founders of this church that I still attend, and you can feel them when you go. You know, some Sundays you may want to miss, but they're like, no. You get up and you go.
Joycelyn, did you say sometimes you want to be bedside Baptist? Church of the
And
Holy
well,
Comforter?
you know, I live within 3 minutes of the church. I live within 3 minutes, so yeah.
Well, you know, having said that, and really thinking about these community touchstones, literal community touchstones, when you put your hand on those markers that remind us, right? I now want to turn to Ms. Vida with that in mind, because this is a very important moment. I listed all the stories and themes that this film covers, and one of the things that comes to mind is that you all are all on this stage, and this is an extremely important conversation because this is one of many Black communities that are experiencing many of these situations where you're just trying to hold on, right? And also get acknowledgement of we were here, we still are here. And so, Vida, I want to find out from you, because you had some powerful comments in the film, and I'd like to hear, yes, you can go ahead and give her a round of applause. But I want to hear from you, and look, Vida knows me. I'm gonna be like, I don't want those long pauses where you're like, well.
The Vita pause is what Dr. Jackson calls it.
So I want to hear from you, your thoughts on gentrification.
So the Vita pause. This is something that I've struggled with saying this publicly, just because, you know, you see me in a film sometimes saying, I don't know if I should say that, because I work in corporate America, and I'm always so cognizant of my words coming back to bite me. I'm moving up in leadership in my job, and what are the white people I work with going to think when they see this? So I guess I'll just say it today. So no, I don't want gentrification in Africatown. I want Africatown to be the Black that it was when it was founded. My ancestors were all Black. Now, there was a white presence in Africatown at the beginning, but you see how that turned out. I mean, those were our enslavers. So I want Africatown to be Black, Black business, Black residents, just Black.
You see how she did that woo-saw moment? Because I asked her this question backstage. I said, I'm going to ask you this question. And she did that pause and did that little corporate analysis.
Yeah.
And she gave me her answer. And I said, then you need to answer like that. And you need to expound on that thought process. Because I'm sure I could ask all y'all in this audience how many people are going through that thought process every day. Right?
Absolutely. You got to worry about, like, I don't want to be worried about what people are going to say, because I'm a descendant of the Africans on the Clotilda. That's not going to change. And it's just time to be brave about who we are and just stand up for that. just not worry about what everybody thinks.
And that doesn't take away from our affiliations and our friendships with the diverse friends that we have, even family, right?
Absolutely.
That we have. And even in saying that you want Africatown to stay Black, it's also this sense of just having a control of your destiny. Not necessarily no one else can move in,
Right.
but having control of the destiny of that community.
That's the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that comment, and I really appreciate it. And then I'm gonna go to Vita and Joycelyn together, and then you three aren't off the hot seat yet.
Okay.
So Vita and Joycelyn, I'd like to find out from you what kind of things are going on in the community right now. What changes are you seeing, and how are you seeing the dial being moved since the film has come out?
Well, I'm very impatient. I want to see things happen now. But the tangible thing is the Heritage House, and it will be open within a couple of months. So I want to see more. I want to see a house being built. I am working on a little campaign with some of the business owners in the Africatown community because that's a huge problem. So I've sat in offices with some of these business owners, and that has never happened. So now I'm on this huge little campaign. So things are coming along, but they're not fast enough for me because the story is so big and it's so huge and it's so rich. And the richness of the story does not match the community. And I'm ready for the change. I don't want to wait anymore because this story is over 150 years. How long should we wait for someone to come in to do some tangible things, things that, you know, can, within a drop of a hat, that could be done?
Street lights.
Street lights, sidewalks, garbage cans, simple necessities. We have people who have their roofs repaired, but once you have your roof repaired, you know, your floor is caving in. So can we get assistance with that? And Africatown needs so much, and it needs to happen now.
Well, you know, I'm glad that Kern spoke up because it changed the dynamic of your answer. Because as you're saying what you want to see, when you get down to the specifics, there very well may be someone in the audience, someone tuning in, who says, you know what, we got some street lights we can send down. We have X that we can send down. And so it's so vastly important that we always put out into the universe, practically speaking, this is what we need, you know?
And it's a matter of us putting together plans too. Like Joycelyn said, there are things that are happening, but we've been put in touch with people, and we are having meetings that we never would have thought we'd have before. And we're talking to people, but we're not just talking like we're like Joycelyn said, we're getting impatient. We're starting to put timelines, and you know, we need this to happen now. So what can you do right now? Not you. Okay, what can you do? So things are actually moving, but it's a slow process. But I think we're getting a little bit more impatient. We're getting a little bit bolder, and we do, you know, we welcome help, and it does not just mean financial help. It doesn't mean just, you know, people can do things. There's technology all over the country. It's amazing what you can do when you just jump in and sign on. You have talents and resources. So everybody is a part of Africatown. You know, you can all be a part of this. So just find out what groups speak to you, and you know what matches what your passion is. Like my passion is environmental justice, or I call it environmental injustice, and my passion is redevelopment. So I'm just pushing my way into these groups that are working to redevelop Africatown and fighting for environmental justice in Africatown. So you can just get involved.
Well, I'm glad you said that because it's interesting. Like I said, there are many communities around the country, and while we're talking about African Americans, there are a lot of historic communities, even, you know, beyond just African American communities, that oftentimes are sitting with the limited resources. And so I can only imagine the stories you could tell that would help folks out here and those who are tuning in about, this is where I had to go. I had to look this up. These are the ways I found my resources. So I appreciate you sharing some of that. Let me ask you, Margaret, and mindful of what we were just talking about, one thing I love is the role that I think it's powerful, you know, what Amir has done to get this film to the screen, and Netflix and the Obamas, Higher Ground. But participant is quite a different partner. And I would love to hear you expound a little bit on why they are different.
Well, Diane Wireman, who is no longer with us, is the person I went to at a certain, like after development, because I knew that one thing Participant does that no one else does is they do an impact campaign alongside the film. So the day the film drops, the impact campaign starts, and a lot of those people are back here. And a lot of Participant is here today. And I can't really see right now, but I see a lot of, I imagine, that's Rosalina Delvon, Michael, David Lindy, Laura Kim. I think Rocio, I'm forgetting people, Emma, Courtney. But yeah, we have a whole team that makes sure, and if I'm forgetting anybody, y'all better remind me, but that makes sure that this film, you know, descendantfilm.com, the website, people go there. Like, I mean, one amazing thing about the website, if you write some of the groups, like you will get one of these people on the stage here. Like they can connect you to the story. They can organize a tour for you in Africatown, and they can tell you ways to support, you know, these groups. So I think it's been really exciting to see like the incredible work that the Impact team has done to sort of start these conversations. Like Kern said, this is sort of, or Joycelyn said, this is the beginning. The film is a part of a much larger conversation. So, you know, to have that kind of platform to push the story further is immense.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that. And the other thing with that impact campaign, as you talk about, is that they facilitate making introductions to the change makers that are going to be able to help and do the things that both Vita and Joycelyn have spoken about. But also, it's important to acknowledge those who have been on the ground doing that as well, and I'm going to do that when we come to the end of this, because we're going to have a little roll call. So, Amir, you know, with everything that you're doing, and thank goodness for the work that you've done to, you know, be involved in bringing these productions to life. You had your Academy Award-winning film, Summer of Soul, which was amazing. Yeah. And now, you know, being part of this project. And so how does it feel for you? It's one thing to produce a film, and I'm sure Summer of Soul connected with you directly, but to then produce a film that literally connects with you directly.
Sometimes, and we were talking about this earlier, oftentimes leaders, and when I say leaders, I mean reluctant leaders. I think every leader starts off reluctantly because, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty and doubt. So in moving from the pivot of just not being whatever you know me as, in the Roots or the Tonight Show or drummer or that sort of thing. You know, I definitely didn't think, you know, back in 2000, you know, working on the D'Angelo record, like, yo, 20 years from now, I see the future, I'm gonna be a storyteller and that sort of thing. But I think for me, it just started. Usually things with me start with complaining, like, man, someone needs to do something about this. And, you know, I think it was maybe it was Obama that I first heard say, you know, I'm certain he's echoing it. He wasn't the first to say it, but I think it resonated with me when he said that, you know, you gotta be the change that you wanna see. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I'm from the hip hop generation, and, you know, when you're 20 and you're 30 or whatever, and you see adults down the line like, oh, somebody else will do that. And now I'm that 50-year-old, that adult that has to do that. So I think with any project I get involved with, whatever, like I'm working on filmed simultaneously right now. And the common ground is, one, as I said before, Black erasure is real, so it's, storytellers are very important. And for me, just elevating and amplifying our history is important because it can easily be disposed of. And so that's where I see my need and culture for the moment to be a historian.
Yeah, well, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and our other storyteller, Kern. So, how does it feel for you to be back in D.C.?
I love it. Y'all don't understand. Remember we had them folk festivals on the mall? So when I was like, 9, 10 years old, my mom and daddy didn't know it, but I would drive down all the way from Northwest down here to the folk festivals and hang out with those itinerant blues singers from Germany who didn't have nowhere else in the world to live but in Germany because they couldn't make no money in Tennessee no more, right? So when I come back here to this structure here, Anderson has a wonderful insight. What are you going to do when you leave this place? It's not just streetlights. And Africatown ain't no Wakanda. But Africatown needs everybody in here's resources and talents, because these folks been holding it down. And we have expectations. And so you go to that website, and we got the African American drummer who's going to help me take kids to Africa. He don't know it yet. Right? So when we go for part 2, and Margaret documents it.
It's not just going to be me. There's a few other directors on the stage here.
You're taking manifestation to the nth degree right now. I like this.
And we're going to make it happen. That's right. And so, that's where I'm at right now. It's not just about being back in D.C. It's that this community that's attending this event is also historical. Yeah. And also has historic legacies. Yeah. And it's what we do.
Yeah. Well, with that in mind, and this is to, everyone can think about this, I want to check for time. Thank you. But Joycelyn, you made a comment about it's not just about the ship, right? At the same time, we can't divorce the ship from Africatown. And the ship really did the story of the Clotilda, the story of the transatlantic slave trade, the story of surviving that Middle Passage, the story of the brutality of what these men and women went through, the story of 5 years of enslavement, and the story of fighting for justice and still fighting for justice today, right? And so, it would seem like it's a given that we all talk about, well, here's what my connection is, how I think about the history of slavery and freedom.
Right.
But we haven't really talked about the history of slavery and freedom today. We've been talking about current day events, really. And so I'm just curious for each of you, like your growing up, how you learned about slavery and freedom. Did you just learn about slavery? Did you just learn about the brutality of it? And in your own story, learning about resistance, which is the Black History theme for this year, in case you all didn't know, resistance. And so I'd like to know from each of you about your relationship to the story of slavery and freedom in this nation and how this experience has changed you.
I'll start, I guess. I think as a white Southerner, it's important for me to pay attention to this and do my part, and that's what I felt like I was doing with this film. It pivoted certainly when I thought one thing I had was, the Mayer family will talk to me. They might not talk to the New York Times or the New Yorker or the Guardian or the Washington Post, but Helen Mayer was in a film I brought to Sundance and they'll talk to me. But that didn't end up being true. That's kind of where I started, And I felt like that's my place, is to tell these painful histories as a white person from the South.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
As a child of the 70s, having two parents that were steeped into the civil rights era, the 60s, even as a 4-year-old, when Roots came on television, it was required watching. And, you know, I was 4 or 5 years old at the time. And so at first I was like, why are they making me watch this? Like, what is this? And we had to have the talk. So at the age of 5, I'm having the talk. And as with a lot of us as Black people in this country, especially dealing with generational trauma, epigenetics, and how we push off into the future. I think now, especially after the pandemic, like this is the most I've ever heard we as Black people talk about freeing ourselves from the kind of cycle that we were trapped in, you know, dealing with mental health publicly at least. You know, I would never tell anybody like, I've been in therapy for like 25, 30 years, but no, I'm not letting nobody know I'm in therapy. They think I'm, you know, like we were dismissive about it, like, oh, that's crazy people talk. So I, you know, since the age of 5, I've been aware of this, and even through my life, I'm realizing that I'm carrying the trauma of my dad, the trauma of my grandfather, the trauma of my great-grand, so on and so forth. So, you know, I'm the beginning of the Mason-Dixon timeline for mental health in my family.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Yeah. And also, when you talk about that trauma, you're also now connecting with the power and the strength of that history. So that's really powerful, right?
I very much believe that we can heal the past and the future.
Yeah.
And again, when we have that real talk about our spiritual practice and where we came from, then that, in my belief, is how we will heal our ancestors and our greats, our descendants. Yeah.
Mary, say something about history in plain sight.
Oh, yeah. Well, I always talk about this. I always talk about history in plain sight. I mean, shoot, we walk on ground, and every day you turn around and you hear about another burial ground that's found. Every day you walk by buildings, and I worked in D.C. with the Humanities Council of D.C., and it was in the midst of the shift and the gentrification, and I would talk about how we walk by these buildings. Let's just take U Street, for example, and everything changes. And what goes up, I call them historic headstones. There was a Black man who lived here one time, so they put a plaque up, but really don't honor the significance, really the significance of everything that's going on in the community, to the point that people are priced out, and you know, things are changed, and change is good, but some, you know, it has to be thoughtful change, smart change, right? And inclusive change. And so when I think of history in plain sight, it is in the people, it's in the buildings, it's in the landscape, it's everywhere. And we can't forget that. We have to acknowledge that. Yeah. So your deal, and then we're gonna wrap up, because I have to do this little list before we wrap up. So you don't want to add to that, Kern, about slavery and freedom?
Mobile now ground zero. We have a ship in the water that has its hull intact. And so our struggle and the descendant struggles are who's going to control that?
Yeah.
Where is it going to go? Is it going to become part of our spiritual practice? And so I'm not thinking about it in terms of the past. I'm thinking about how we're going to wrestle with that tangible artifact going forward, and what it means to those of us who don't know who our ancestors are.
Yeah.
And so that's the crossroads that I'm existing at right now.
Thank you. Joycelyn.
When you asked the question about Black history, I'm thinking about my father. And he grew up during the movement as well. And one thing that I don't want to say what he made me watch, and I can't sing, but maybe somebody can help me with this. But this is a show that I had to watch as a child. The one thing we did right was the day we started to fight, keep your eyes on the prize. That's how I got a lot of my Black history from him, from my teachers.
Yeah.
So it's always been embedded. But kids today, I don't know if they would sit and watch Eyes on the Prize. But that's how I learned about Emmett Till, SNCC, the Black Panther Party, and all those things. So I remember that watching as a child. We used to buy the VHS tapes. You know, at the end of the show, it was like, you want to order it? We would order it, and I would watch it. You know, my father used to listen to the Dead Poets Society. I was like, you know, he was like that person.
Yeah.
And he was the one that would say, Joycelyn, you're not just a descendant, you're a direct descendant. And he was, my mother is the descendant. He was so, you know, amazed by our story because he couldn't trace back his roots. So he embedded it in me to like, you go to Lorna, you ask questions. You go to your grandmother, you ask questions. Do you know where you're standing in Lewis Quarter? Because I remember as a child, Lorna telling him about where we were standing. You know, and I was telling Amir, I was like, it was just a thing. I'm going to Mama's house. We're going to the quarters. Didn't know it was a slave quarters. Didn't know, you know, that it established in 1870. Like, we have family members still living there today, and there's not a proper historical marker there. And you've seen in the film where they had a Mardi Gras sign that my uncle decorates sometimes, but my ancestor does not have a proper burial site. It was encroached by Gulf Lumber, and I'm not getting off the subject of Black history, but that's all ties into it. You know, so I feel like I was a child of the movement through my father, who I miss dearly, but I know he'll be proud of me. You know?
Well, you know, yeah. I'm going to say to you, Joycelyn, how apropos that you named your event the Spirit of the Ancestors, because you are the Spirit of the Ancestors, right? And for all those shows that you watched, for Roots, for Eyes on the Prize, for all these shows that have come out that we watched on PBS, guess what? There's going to be some child down the road in this building that's in existence into perpetuity that's going to say, you know what, I remember watching Descendant. So I'm going to go to you, Vita, and then I'm going to wrap up so everyone can get home and reflect on everything they've seen and heard today.
I will be brief. When we think about slavery, I think about the fact that this mindset is not that far in the past, because as a child in the 70s, I had an experience with the Klan. You know, the Klan was still rallying in Mobile in the 1970s in their sheets and hoods, and I remember being in a car approaching an intersection with my mother driving, where she stopped, she said, "Get down," and we got down, and she just waited until traffic cleared, and we floored it through that intersection. It's dangerous. In the 1970s, the last Black man to be lynched in the 1980s happened in Mobile. So this is these are experiences I had in my life. We were taught, you'll hear somebody say in the film, we were taught to be quiet. Don't talk about this outside, because we have this fear that this recent in the past, we still had to worry about our safety if we talked about these things. So I was brought up with the fear of slavery and white people, but somewhere along the way, I don't know if it's because I'm an Aquarius, but I have a spirit of resistance and defiance. So here we are. You know, we're in a different place right now. Like we are not our ancestors. It's just a little different right now. But you know, we carry our ancestors with us, and we are fighting to keep our ancestors' legacy alive right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I want to thank you. I want to give this panel a round of applause real quick. That's right. Now, you all can't leave. I want you to sit down for one moment, because there's something that I have to do. First, now we are all descendants in this room. Descendant is not a buzzword just for Black people. There are descendants of enslaved and descendants of enslavers. We've all inherited this shared American story. But I am going to call out, if you will, the descendants that are connected to Africatown who are here today to please stand. Thank you. And this one last thing we're about to do, y'all gonna have to bear with me, but we have to call out some names. This is what we do, we call them out, right? And so there are many people that have been involved in this community, have been involved in this journey to provide justice, have been involved to help bring this film to fruition, and continue to be involved. And even in my own job, when I do community engagement, it's not just talking to the folks you see on this stage, it's also talking to government officials, to funders, to community leaders, to church pastors, you name it, right? So I'm gonna call them out without giving any context who they are. They know who they are, but I want you to know that your name was called today. Ramsey Sprague, Elvin Lang, may he rest in peace, Dorothy Walker, Lisa Jones, Carla Noble, Senator Vivian Figures, State Congresswoman Adeline Clark, Commissioner Mercia Ludgood, Justin Zweifach, Ben Raines, Vernetta Henson, Valina McCants, Liz Smith-Inser, Joe Womack, Kamal Siddiqui, Anderson Flynn, Cleon and Angela Jones, Search Inc., Mark Jackson, National Geographic, Deborah Adams, Fred Hebert, and so many others at National Geographic, Natalie Roberson, Sylvie Anjou, Darren Patterson, the Slave Rex Project, Dr. Alex Jones, Reverend Chris Williams, Reverend Derek Tucker, Stacey Hathorn, Reverend Lamar Brady, Zach Manuel, Derek Rogue, Bo Bonfee, Ray Angry, Rhiannon Giddens, Mike Block, Jeffrey Richmond, the Keebies, Joe Turner, Greg Cyprian, Lamar and Keita Howard, Lorna Woods, Sheila Flanagan, Gary Lumbers, Mike Foster, and former U.S. Senator Doug Jones. Thank you. And I didn't forget them, but they were on stage earlier, but I'll also restate Kyle Martin and S.C. Chambers. So thank you all. We are all descendants. This is our American story, and it's told through all of our lenses. So reflect on your own history, and if you do nothing else leaving here, you better sit down with one of your family members and start telling your story. Have a good day.
Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you hold your seats while the panelists clear the stage. Thank you.